reference photo for today. We're going to paint this misty countryside scene together. So before painting, I am going to test out what color mixtures am I going to use for this painting. So I think this is a very good tip, because if you are only going to start mixing your greens during painting, then you might feel like panicked. So it is good that you try, oh, what colors makes the green I want. And here, because it seems to be an autumn scene, so apart from green, there's also a lot of dark orange and red in it. So you really want to make sure you have the right mixture. So I'm just adding colors and even just mixing on the paper, and just to see whether that's what I like. See here, I'm using Mars yellow and the burnt sienna, and add a little bit French ultramarine, and this is a much more lighter, vibrant color. I think I've got enough variety of colors for the foliage. I don't want to mix the exact colors I'm going to use. I want to save some spontaneity for the painting process. So now I'm going to test out the mixture for the grass in the foreground. I'm going to use this very unnatural looking pigment called permanent green. This is what it looks like in itself, by itself. I don't think anything in nature looks like this, so I'm going to tone it down by adding a little bit yellow ochre. I think this is more natural looking, but I think the color in the reference photo is a bit cooler than this, so I'm going to add a little bit cobalt turquoise and see what happens. I'm comparing it to the reference photo. I think I'm gonna change the percentage of each color slightly. I'm washing off the brush so I can do it again. So I am going to start with permanent green. And add a little bit yellow ochre, and then a tiny bit of cobalt turquoise. I think this is the color I want. I'm happy about it. So now let's move on. First of all, I'm going to do a very simple sketch, and in this sketch you're only going to focus on the big shape, which is indicated in the top corner view. So I'm only going to draw the outlines of the mountains and then the dark paths in the fields. If you want, you can also lightly sketch out the more reddish foliage closer to the viewer. That's all the drawing we need. So let's tape the paper onto the board I'm using. So this board is acrylic board. You can tape it to any board that you can find, wood, plastic, doesn't matter, because I'm only using a single piece of watercolor paper. It's not a block, so if you only wet one side of the paper, it's gonna buckle up, it won't stay flat, and it will make the painting process very difficult. So you want to use art tape or artist tape. and to tape it down onto some flat and hard surface. Once it is taped to the board, you want to press the tape against the paper very well so that no gaps exist, so that water won't leak into the gaps. Now thoroughly wet the paper. I placed this artist tape that I just used underneath the board so that it has a maybe 15-degree slant, because I want the watercolor paint to run down. So this angle will help that process. First, I'm going to start with the sky. Despite the fact that it is white in the reference photo, I don't want to leave it completely white. So I'm going to mix a very light gray with burnt sienna and French ultramarine. So I'm making the gray a little bit darker because I want some variation in the sky. So like just a wisp of cloud here and there. Since the sky is the lightest color, and you can go further down past the sky, going into the distant mountains, because the distant mountains are going to be darker than the sky. And this helps a better, smoother transition. Because the board is tilted, all the water goes down and then they accumulate at the bottom tape. So you want to constantly check whether there is water accumulating, because they might cause some problems, as you will see later. Now I'm going to mix some dark greens for the distant mountains. That is French ultramarine, Mars yellow, Payne's gray, and burnt sienna. So you just want to mix until you get the right tone you want. And here, make sure your brush is not too damp, because the paper right now is very wet. So as you can see, once the brush touches the paper, the paint, the color just disperses. So here, just trying to paint very lightly to see how it performs. Now I'm using a clean brush, damp clean brush, to remove some of the paint. And now I start again on the left side. And using the damp clean brush to help the color disperse downwards better. As you can see, I tilted the board furthermore with my hand because I want the paint to run down vertically. Now I'm making a mixture with burnt sienna and added to the green mixture so that there's a change of tone. So I'm using this mixture to paint the mountains in the front. and adding a little bit burnt sienna, a little bit French ultramarine, and a little bit Mars yellow to make it greener, and some Prussian blue, and a little bit Payne's gray to make it darker, and then painting the foliage on the left side. Even though in the reference photo the distant mountain is quite dark, I want it to be much lighter than the foreground mountains, because the stronger the pigment, it stands out more, so it looks like it's in the foreground rather than in the background. Now I am putting some clean water into the mist area and push some background. As you can see, it has some effects. The water is pushing the pigment down because I tilted the paper. Now I am mixing a reddish mixture with burnt sienna, alizarin crimson. I really should have added some fresh paint of burnt sienna from the tube. And I'm also adding some of the green mixture and then paint the more reddish part of the foliage in the foreground. Now I am letting the board to its original angle because I don't want the paint to run down too much, or it will go into the green field. I'm also adding the mixture to the right side. Now I'm cleaning my palette. I'm going to make the mixture for the grassland in the foreground. So permanent green, yellow ochre, and a cobalt turquoise. Now I'm going to apply it across the paper in the foreground. I'm not so worried about the color of the foliage running down and mix with the this very bright green, but what you can do is to use a clean paper towel to wipe that off before you apply this very bright green. Now I am making a much darker mixture with French ultramarine, burnt sienna, a little bit Mars yellow, a little bit alizarin crimson, it's quite purplish, so I'm adding more yellow, and now Payne's gray to make it much darker, and a little bit Prussian blue. I'm using this quite complicated mixture to paint the more greenish foliage in the middle, and then actively leave out the shape of the foliage before it. And I'm actually tilting the board backwards, meaning I lift the bottom side up so that the paint can run down to the top of the paper in that direction and look like trees. Now I'm adding a little bit more burnt sienna to that same mixture and paint the darker parts of the foliage on the right side. And I'm still tilting the board backwards. also wanted to add a little bit alizarin crimson just to make the mixture more fun. You know, there's some red, some orange, some green, just like foliage in autumn. A little bit more burnt sienna and alizarin crimson, and then I'm painting the darker part of the foliage and on the left side, the shadow part. Now I switch to a smaller brush and pick up the same paint and add a little bit of red, and I want to splash onto the mixture. And you can use any pen or brush holder, and then you just knock the brush onto the other pen or brush. And I realized the paint is not dark enough, so I'm mixing a darker mixture with the same colors. And here I should have chosen a harder brush, I mean a brush with harder hair that will help you splash better. And you also want to make sure there's enough paint on the brush or it wouldn't come off the brush. As you can see, I not only splashed the dark paint onto the foliage, but also in the foreground grassland and also a little bit in the misty part. It's not a problem, and don't panic, we can fix it later, as I will show. Now I'm using that very dark mixture to paint the bottom part of the foliage and those darker short foliage in the grassland, and maybe their paths. It doesn't really matter what they are, just make some suggestive brush strokes. And you can always add a little bit more yellow or red or blue in the same mixture to change up a little bit so that the colors on your painting are more interesting. And in this part of the grassland, there's some darker patches, so I'm just making some brush strokes. Now I'm just adding some darker colors to the bottom of those shorter bushes. You don't really need to paint each individual tree, that's not necessary. Now I am switching to a smaller round brush, picking up the same dark mixture, adding some more finer lines here and there, make it more interesting. Now I'm picking up all the colors left in the palette, add a little bit more Mars yellow and French ultramarine to make it a little bit darker. And I am going to flick some paint onto the grassland in the foreground with my finger so that the foreground, the grassland, looks more interesting. It's not just flat green. Now I am just adding similar colors, French Ultramarine, Mars Yellow, Payne's Gray, and a little bit burnt sienna to make a very dark color. And I'm going to paint those dark trees that stand out, relatively higher than the lower bushes. And you want to make sure that the distance between these trees vary from each other so they don't look quite artificial. You want some are closer, some are farther from each other. Now I'm just using a very dark mixture to paint the lower bottom of the bush, which is the shadow part, because it's on the bottom the light can't shine through. So this looks much more 3D. Now I am going to paint those trees that stand out much closer to us. So I'm going to make a mixture with burnt sienna. I'm trying to get enough paint out of my palette. It's really dry. And some of the dark mixture, a little bit more French ultramarine to make it darker, a little bit Mars yellow. And I think it's not red enough, so I'm adding a little bit of Alizarin crimson. And now I'm just going to paint the foliage. I think I'm just going to paint two of them. Add a little bit of red, a little bit blue, just directly adding to the wet mixture on the paper so that the color can mix by themselves. I can see there's some paths by the tree, so I'm picking up some dark dirty color from a palette and make a very fine line here and there. Now I'm going to switch to my rigger and pick up a very dark color, which is Payne's Gray, and add a little bit burnt sienna to make it more natural looking, make the dark mixture more natural looking. And I'm going to paint the branches and the trunk. Because the paper is still a little bit damp, so you want to make sure that the mixture that you use for the tree trunk and branches is not too wet. In fact, if you start with a very dry mixture, like directly out of the tube, and you find it's very difficult to make brush strokes, then you can always add a little bit of water. But then if you go with a very wet mixture, and then you might create backgrounds or cauliflowers that you don't want. And then I'm also trying to paint some trees that don't have any leaves, just with a lot of branches. but I think I need an even smaller rigger for those trees. But before that, I think the foliage looks a little bit dull, so I am using this very small rigger and just add a little bit clean water to the top of a tree to actually force some background and make it look much more lively. Now I'm picking up the very dark mixture, which is a mixture of Payne's gray and burnt sienna, and draw those trees. As you can see, this rigger allows me to make very fine lines. And here you want to make these trees different from each other in terms of height, shape, and distance from each other. I'm done with the right side. Now I'm moving on to the left side and to add more details of branches. Now I find the lower part of the bush looks a little bit too light, so I'm making a very dark mixture. Here I actually use a little bit sap green because I want some green in it, and adding more burnt sienna, and just make some dry brushes and at the bottom of those low bushes to make it more interesting. And here my brush is very dry, so that you can make brush strokes that maybe looks like grass. I'm also adding a little bit alizarin crimson to the mixture to make it a little bit different in tones, and just make these dry brush strokes so that it has texture. If you don't like the dry brush strokes you can always smooth it out with a damp brush. And here I'm also making some dry brush strokes to suggest the foliage for this type of tree. I don't know what they are. But here it's better to use dry brush because it creates texture. Also, I'm able to make these dry brushstroke because the paper is almost dry. And here, since we're adding details, there is really no limit, but you don't want to add too much detail, um, just enough to make the painting interesting. I think I'm fine with all the trees and the branches, but I just realized there is a background at the bottom of my paper, as you can see, and I think I'm going to fix it. I'm making the same mixture I used to paint that part of the grassland. But here you want to make sure that the paper is dry, because if you're introducing a wetter wash, a wetter paint, then it will create more background. Now I'm just gonna paint over this entire part of the grassland. Now I'm checking whether I want to add more details or not. I think I want to splash a little bit paint onto the grass again because I don't want it to look too flat. So more splashing. I don't think this mixture is dark enough, so I'm adding a little bit more of the dark mixture on my palette, and splash, splash, and a splash. I think I'm fine with this effect. It's almost done. Now I just need to fix those accidental splashes in the sky, the dark spots. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my smallest rigger brush, and I'm going to make them into flying birds out of the woods. So pick up some dark paint. And since I don't want my hand to smudge the lower part of the painting because I just applied the very bright green, so I'm using a brush to support my wrist, and I'm going to make some brush strokes to suggest flying birds. And here you can make the directions of their wings and different from each other so that it looks more interesting. And actually, you don't need to paint the wings for each black dots in the sky because um, if some birds are very, very far away, it probably just looks like some tiny dots. And because these black dots are created by splashing, not by you painting each individual dot, so they disperse very unevenly, which makes it look very natural. You can also add birds where there are originally no dots, just to make the composition looks more dynamic and interesting. Actually, before you start a painting, you can first practice how to make these suggestive strokes to paint birds in distance so that you don't feel too unprepared during the painting process. I think this is good enough, and that's enough birds. So I'm done with the painting. Now the only thing that's left to do is to sign. The painting is done. This is the end result. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click like and subscribe.